Beware, beware, for where she goes, death and destruction are sure to follow. If you see her come to your country, run for the hills. Beware, she is the White Death, the Yellow Plague. She is a Karen.
70 dead and counting.
So we have to maintain UN principles of international law and, fuck the EU, that protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every single country, notably including Ukraine. And U.S. advisors serve in almost a dozen Ukrainian ministries and localities.
How does Jabba the Hutt over here get to decide what happens in Ukraine? Who exactly is this person? In this first video of many, we begin a series called Unmasking the Deep State, starting with our favorite Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland. You can find sections of the video highlighted for you at the bottom should you like to skip to certain parts. But for now, let's begin from the beginning, her childhood. Chapter 1. Young Victoria Nuland. Victoria was born on July 1st, 1961 in New York City. Her mother, a gifted pianist. Her father, Sherwin Nuland, descendant of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, was a revered surgeon who taught bioethics, medicine, and the history of medicine at Yale. Now, this is how he recounts meeting his first wife.
When I took one look at her and I just decided that's the person I'm going to marry. And I convinced her in 6 weeks to marry me, and so we were engaged for another 6 weeks, then we got married.
It was love at first sight. He had just become chief resident at Yale at 29 years old, but things would then take a turn for the worst.
What I didn't know at that time was that she was bipolar. I didn't know that either. And for the next years, she would become depressed for 6 months, and when April came, she'd suddenly, within days, become manic. And we had some really bad times, but we did have 2 perfectly wonderful children.
Sherwin Nuland would describe his marriage to Victoria's mother in a TED Talk given in 2001, saying,
In the 1960s, in a marriage, to use the word bad would be perhaps the understatement of the year. It was dreadful. As things got worse, as we really began to hate each other, I became progressively depressed over a period of a couple of years, trying to save this marriage, which was inevitably not to be saved.
As her father admits, this was severely deteriorating his mental health. The constant fights, resentment, and hate between the two was weighing too much on Sherwin. All the while, he's still having to prepare for surgeries that can take up to 12 to 18 hours to complete. He goes on to elaborate this more.
Oh, my major surgical cases, I was scheduling them for 1 o'clock in the afternoon because I couldn't get out of bed before about 11 o'clock. Anybody who's been depressed here knows what that's like. I couldn't even pull the covers off myself.
All of this would finally culminate when Sherwin had to be checked into a mental ward at his university, and he would stay there for 13 months. It would be an understatement to say Victoria Nuland had a difficult childhood. A bipolar mother, a depressed father, fighting every day, hatred, resentment. But there's more. Victoria Nuland attended the prestigious boarding school known as Choate Rosemary Hall. She was a graduate of the school in 1979. This institution is famous for its remarkable list of alumni, which includes governors, State Department officials, actors, poets, and so on. Perhaps its most illustrious alumnus is President John F. Kennedy, who was a student there in the 1930s alongside his older brother. Notable figures such as Eleanor Roosevelt were frequent guest speakers at the school. Essentially, if you had the means, Choate Rosemary Hall was the place to receive a top-tier education. The school is also notorious as it's recently been uncovered that the school had substantiated cases of sexual misconduct. Some of it goes back to the early 1960s, all the way to the early 2000s. In the New York Times coverage of the scandal, they reported that the school had prevented allegations of sexual conduct from getting out for decades. According to the report, sexual misconduct matters were handled internally and quietly. Even if a teacher had been terminated for sexual misconduct with another student, the rest of the faculty were told very little, and sometimes nothing, about what had happened. As recently as 2010, a faculty member named Charles Timlin had kissed a student, made inappropriate comments to her, But the headmaster of the school decided that this behavior had not warranted Charles's termination. It was only until the abused student's father had contacted the school, after which they eventually dismissed Mr. Timlin for his behavior. There is no direct evidence that Victoria herself ever experienced any kind of abuse or would have known it was going on. However, in the investigative report published by an independent group looking into all the accusations, they would find at least 12 staff and teachers who worked in the school from 1969 to as late as 2016. 5 of the 12 staff were working in the school between 1975 to 1979, the same years Victoria was in attendance. Now, we can't make any direct connections between her and sexual abuse, and it would be wrong to do so. But if it is the case that this was just a fact of life in the school's culture, everyone kind of knew this was going on, what kind of psychological damage would that do to someone in their teens? As former student Cheyenne Montgomery, who graduated in 1992 and was abused by 2 teachers there, said, these things were really embedded in the culture, and not just at Choate. There is something that I neglected to mention, something that I skipped over in the beginning of this video. See, when I said Sherwin Nuland was born to immigrant parents who came from Eastern Europe, well, in Sherwin Nuland's book, Lost in America, he talks about his father being from an area called Bessarabia. His father left Bessarabia in 1907. What is Bessarabia? Bessarabia is now modern-day Ukraine/Moldova. This means that Victoria Nuland has Ukrainian lineage in her. What does this mean exactly? Does this explain some of her motivations? All this and more in the next chapter. Chapter 2. A State Department agent is born. Victoria Nuland would go on to graduate from Brown University in 1983, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts degree. She studied Russian literature, political science, and history. 1 year later, she would join the U.S. State Department as a Foreign Service officer, a job which seemed to suit Nuland's own ambitions. Nuland's new job would be to promote peace, support prosperity, and protect American citizens while, quote, advancing the interest of the U.S. abroad. Oddly ambiguous what advancing the interest of the U.S. abroad exactly means. Even on the State Department's own website, they admit that they're looking for people who can, quote, retain their composure in times of great stress, like a military coup. Very specific, huh? None of this should be surprising, though. Given everything we know about her childhood, high school education, and college, we can infer she was recruited by the State Department. How can we infer this? Well, colleges, especially Ivy Leagues like Brown and Middlebury College, are where a lot of State Department officials are recruited from. If you look at the list of alumni from these kinds of colleges, you'll find a lot of people on those lists that are responsible for the corrupt nature of our government today. But just what kind of people do these government agencies look for in these colleges? Thanks to John Perkins, former economic hitman, who wrote a tell-all book on his role in making smaller countries almost completely dependent on America, we know that the State Department looks for people who come from imperfect backgrounds. In his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, he recounts being interviewed by an NSA recruiter. He says, "Under examination, I admitted that as a loyal American I opposed the war, and I was surprised when the interviewers did not pursue this subject. Instead, they focused on my upbringing, my attitude towards my parents, the emotions generated by the fact I had grew up as a poor Puritan among so many wealthy, hedonistic preppies. They also explored my frustration about the lack of women, sex, and money in my life. At first I assumed all these things that seemed so negative to me marked me as an NSA reject. But the interviews continued, suggesting otherwise. From an NSA viewpoint, these negatives are actually positive. Their assessment had less to do with issues of loyalty to my country than with the frustrations of my life, my ultimate rebellion against my father, my ability to get along with foreigners, and my willingness to lie to the police were exactly the types of attributes they sought." With that in mind, and given what we know about Nuland's terrible childhood, Nuland seems like a juicy target for the State Department for a potential agent to carry out their agenda. Now, as we continue on studying Victoria Nuland's past and where she came from, it's important that we look at her husband, Robert Kagan, arguably more important for the influence of foreign policy in the U.S. State Department that would shape it for the next 20 to 30 years. Victoria would meet her husband early on in her career in 1983. At this time, Robert was a speechwriter for George Shultz. Before that, he was the editor-in-chief for the student-led Yale Political Monthly. Kagan finished Yale with a BA in history in 1980, and only 4 years later became a member of the U.S. State Department Policy Planning staff. Later on, he would serve in the State Department Bureau of Inter-American Affairs from 1986 to 1988. Around this time, Nuland would be working on the China desk at the State Department. From 1991 to 1993, Victoria Nuland and her husband would share an apartment together in Moscow. Nuland was serving as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Russia. Describing her experience to journalists, Nuland would recount how her husband used the spare bedroom of their apartment to write. She said, "The KGB used to rifle his office regularly. We could tell by the lingering stench of cigarettes and body odor. They couldn't fathom that he was really just a writer." As Kagan's history shows, in fact, he wasn't just a writer, but someone who would formulate U.S. foreign policy in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1997, Robert Kagan would go on to create a neoconservative think tank called PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. The organization's founding document stated that American leadership is good both for America and for the world, and sought to build support for a Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity. Kagan believed that the American mission would be to ensure its role as the sole superpower in the post-Soviet world, which would have sufficient military might to deter any group of nations that might challenge the new American empire. Through his work in the newly created PNAC, Kagan would be a strong advocate of liberal interventionism in Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, and especially Iraq, where Kagan stated the need to remove Saddam Hussein and his regime from power. He called on then-President Clinton to put ground troops in Iraq, stating that bombing Iraq wasn't enough.
Welcome back! Top 10 reasons why Bertrand Russell was actually one of the best peacemakers in all of history. Starting with number 1, he made the peace symbol popular. That's right. He was one of the original designers of the peace symbol against atomic war. People actually believe this shit?
Chapter 3. The Nuland Mindset. If her crazy childhood wasn't enough to convince you this woman is crazy, or the fact that she married a really fat Kevin James who's even more bloodthirsty than she is, let me try and convince you further. Everything Victoria Nuland is doing now is very much in tandem with what her husband believes, and we will explore that a little more, but we need to look at something here that is very important when judging current events, and that's understanding the ideas that shape current politics today, and it might surprise you. We talk about modern-day warmongers today like Antony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan, so on and so forth, but their policy is not original. They weren't born bloodthirsty warmongers. In fact, I can originate it back to Bertrand Russell. See, Bertrand Russell, the supposed peacenik who invented the peace sign, was actually a big advocate for what Victoria Nuland might agree with, which is this might makes right kind of policy. Here's what he said in regards to nuclear bombs. He said, "It is entirely clear that there is only one way in which great wars can be permanently prevented, and that is the establishment of an international government with a monopoly of serious armed forces. An international government, if it is to be able to preserve peace, must have the only atomic bombs, the only plant for producing them, the only air force, the only battleships, and generally whatever is necessary to make it irresistible." And he believed the United States should have preemptively bombed the Soviet Union before they were able to develop their own nuclear bomb. This kind of thinking has shaped British and American foreign policy for the last 80 years and continues to do so. And in the course of those 80 years, anyone who has presented an alternative or an objection to this policy has been assassinated, blackmailed, or turned corrupt. And Victoria Nuland continues this objective. With all this in mind, it makes sense why Nuland would marry someone who believes these kinds of ideals too. Robert Kagan's role in the US State Department is to dictate the real, fascist, tyrannical policy that has caused leaders to be overthrown, innocent civilians killed, and critical infrastructure to be destroyed. Nuland's job is to dress up all that ugliness into democracy. In this 2014 clip, Victoria Nuland is talking about the Ukrainian Maidan coup, a coup that she herself admits she helped start to overthrow President Yanukovych. This clip takes place at a time in history just before Yanukovych was ousted. Listen to how it always comes back to how this benefits the United States, not Ukraine.
So why does the United States have an interest in how this turns out? Our chairman and ranking member have spoken to that. It's because countries that live freely and independently and respect the rule of law are more stable, and they make better partners for the United States. The same principles and values that Ukrainians are fighting for are the cornerstone of all free democracies, and America supports these values in every country on the planet.